Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone, and welcome to the fourth round of Islamicate Book Reviews with myself, al-Azami, and Omar Anchassi. We've done this for sort of 4 previous sessions now, so we're not going to actually introduce ourselves. Inshallah, that's something which you can gather from the on-screen sort of paraphernalia. And inshallah, we're going to jump straight into this week's session by discussing, inshallah, Omar will introduce the book for the session, Kitab al-Maqalat, attributed to Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, died in the year 303 of the Hijri calendar, something like 913 or 15, if I recall correctly, of the Gregorian. And you can correct me on that, Omar. And the format's the usual. Omar's going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes about the book. Then I'll engage in a conversation with him. And then we'll go into Q&A. People are welcome to ask questions, and we'll sort of, any questions that come up in the comment section, you can do that on Facebook, you can do that on YouTube, and potentially on Periscope as well. We will, inshallah, show on the screen and try to respond to in the last probably 15 minutes or so of the show. If you're interested in keeping in touch with us, meaning watching us on a regular basis, please do remember to like, follow, or subscribe, depending on the platform. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So inshallah, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Omar, to introduce the book.
Thank you very much. Pardon me. You may be right. I might have a cough of some kind. But anyway, today we will be discussing a very interesting and very early work, the Kitab al-Maqalat, attributed to Abu Ali al-Jubba'i. And again, I would like to thank my friend Zakaria al-Hubba for sending me a copy of this work. I hadn't been able to source a copy myself because of travel restrictions owing to COVID. This work is fascinating because it's so early. The great majority of the theological literature of that period, the 3rd century, and previously, of course, is lost to us and is only extant in fragments. And in the last few years, we've been extremely lucky, not only with early texts, and this links back to points we made last week when discussing Ahmed al-Shamsi's book. There are always new editions of early text, new manuscripts being discovered, new editions coming out, which is fantastic for those of us with a kind of origins fetish, like myself. Right. And the Mu'tazila in particular have benefited from this spate of new editions. Some early works, like the Kitab al-Tahrish of Dirar bin Amr, whose attribution is widely accepted. Of course, some would question his attribution to the Mu'tazila, but anyway. Recently, the Tahdhib fi Tafsir of al-Hakim al-Jishumi, much disagreement about how to pronounce his name. There's a large 10-volume tafsir, and incredibly useful because it preserves many opinions from early Mu'tazila, including, of course, Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, the subject of today's discussion, who is known to have written a large tafsir.
Sorry, could you give us rough death dates for al-Jishami or Jushami? And
he's in the 6th century, early 6th century after the Hijrah. Okay. But his tafsir is encyclopedic, and he gives us, on many ayahs, he'll present the views of Abu Ali and his son Abu Hashim, Qadi Abdul Jabbar, and many other important Mu'tazili figures. Right. So he is kind of a very useful, handy reference if you want to know what early Mu'tazila thought about particular verses of the Quran and their interpretation. But anyway, these are just some examples. There are others, indeed. And sometimes these publications are based on the discovery of new manuscripts. Sometimes it is careful editors who have recovered fragments of these works from other works. So Razi in his tafsir and Sheikh al-Ta'if al-Tusi and others also cite Mu'tazili opinions quite extensively. So we now have the 5-volume collection, Mawsu'at Tafasir al-Mu'tazila, which collects again these various opinions, not based on the discovery of manuscripts, but on fragments quoted by other authors.
Who's
Now,
the editor of that? Forgive me.
Muhammad Khudr Nabha, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just culled from printed works. Now, the Maqalat, and I'll hold up my print off to the camera. So edited, I should say, by two, somewhat embarrassingly for us, Usama, three young Turkish editors, all younger than the two of us. Oskan Simsek, Abdul Karim Iskandar Sarija, and Yusuf Arikaner. So two young Turkish scholars who are working from the copy of a manuscript. The manuscript in which this work is found, attributed to al-Jubba'i, is a manuscript in which we also find the Kitab al-Harish as well as other works. Right. This was discovered by Hassan Ansari in the Yemeni city of Shahara. Right. As Ahmed al-Shamsi says in the book we discussed last week, in some respects, Yemen its manuscripts holdings were less impoverished by Ottoman rule than places like Egypt. Right. And the Zaydis, the important Muslim group or sect, also known to have been quite diligent in the preservation of Mu'tazili works because they subscribe to Mu'tazili theology on the whole and were dependent on them for the preservation of many important works, including the extant parts of the Qadi al-Jabbar's Mughni. So this is one example of such work. And I should say something about its attribution and that its contents. Having reviewed the book before this session, the authors do not really commit themselves to the attribution to al-Jubba'i. And there are many reasons for this. One of the standout reasons is because in most of the biographical literature on al-Jubba'i, I'm speaking about Abu Ali when I say al-Jubba'i, he had the famous son Abu Hasim who became more important than him as a theologian to subsequent Mu'tazila. But Abu Ali, we find his biography in many places, including Ibn Nadim's Fihrist, where it seems to be slightly cut off. But we know of about 70 works from various biographical sources attributed to him. And in almost none of those sources is a Kitab al-Maqalat mentioned. Now, one of the contributions of the three editors is their discovery, building on Hassan Ansari's point. He finds a Kitab al-Maqalat attributed to al-Jubba'i in a work by somewhat obscure Yemeni scholar called al-Jundari, and they established that al-Jundari is actually basing this attribution on the famous Yemeni or Zaydi ibn al-Murtada, who wrote many important Mu'tazili works. And I believe I'm correct in saying that he's also the author of the most important Zaydi fiqh work that's still taught and commented on today in the Yemen. But
I forget.
That's
it's not al-Bahr al-Zakhar or something like that.
No, it's well, the shuruh are called things like Taj al-Mudhahab. Gosh, it will come to me. It will reappear. It appears in various editions. There are a couple of important commentaries, and it's refuted. Well, lots of it is discussed critically and commented on by al-Shawkani in his al-Sayl al-Jarrar. Right. So it's a rhyming title, so I'll remember Ibn al-Murtada's work. Anyway, so only really does Ibn al-Murtada attribute this work to him, and even when he attributes it to him, his characterization of the work does not really correspond to what we find in the published work based on the manuscript. So he says, for instance, in one of his works, Al-Munya wal-Amal, that it's a very descriptive work and he doesn't refute any of the sects he discusses, but actually it's a very polemical work and he refutes all of the sects he discusses, and he devotes really more time to refuting them than he does to accounting for their beliefs. But Ibn al-Murtada, in a different work of his, gives another explanation. But so it's not absolutely clear. This work does indeed belong to al-Jubba'i, but the editors argue very persuasively that it is certainly a Mu'tazili work, and I think that's self-evident. Right. And I mean, he describes the 5 principles of the Mu'tazila and so on. And also, it clearly belongs to the 3rd century, and this is based mostly on, for instance, the authorities the author cites. So he cites, I think, 9 different contemporaries and gives an isnad through them. And all of these, well, most of them lived in the 3rd century, particularly the second half of the 3rd century. And Jubba'i, of course, dies in 303. So even if it's not his, that doesn't matter too much, because it certainly belongs to a Mu'tazili of the 3rd century.
And that's extremely valuable as an early text, basically.
Yes, and very valuable. Many of the sects and groups and views he discusses are really of antiquarian interest, but the major part of his critique is devoted to, and I'll be assuming for the rest of this episode that the author is indeed Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, just to make our lives a bit easier. Okay. So al-Jubba'i's major critique, he discusses many sects, but the major dimension of his critique is directed against those he refers to in derogatory terms as the Hashwiyya, sometimes on rare occasions as the Awam or commoners. By which he means, of course, the Ahl al-Hadith or the proto-Sunnis. And he names actually some of their opponents. He makes it very clear that Imam Ahmad is one of their leaders. And the editors also point out, based on quite clear descriptions, that the text was clearly written after the end of the Mihna. So the proto-Sunnis are triumphant in the period in which the author is writing. He does discuss other works, other sects.
Forgive me, it would be more or less inevitable that it is written after the Mihna, because Ahmad is much earlier than 341 he dies.
Of course, but the Mihna lasts some years. It begins in, this is embarrassing, 219. So in the last 6 months of al-Ma'mun's reign. Right. So we think of al-Ma'mun primarily in terms of the Mihna, but he had a long reign, and this is something that happened only in the last year. Right. But anyway, it's a fascinating work, because we take for granted a particular kind of Sunnism that emerges later and crystallizes later. Sectarian identities are still somewhat fluid, of course, in this period. They only crystallize later. Right. But most of his critique is directed against the proto-Sunnis. There are also substantial sections directed against the Rawafid, which is a general term for Shia groups who reject the caliphates of Abu Bakr, Umar, and Omar. Only one group of which is the Imamis, who kind of you could think of as sort of proto-12ers, but of course you haven't had all 12 Imams by this point, or there hasn't been occultation, or the final occultation by this point. Right. So there are also less lengthy critiques of the Khawarij and the Uthmaniyya and other groups. I mean, sometimes the Uthmaniyya are conflated and other times distinguished from the proto-Sunnis. It does use a variety of sectarian labels, but these, we generally speaking, we can recognize these. We can know, based on the views he describes, which groups he's talking about, and the editors have done, I think, a sterling job of tracing the various views in hadith he cites and critiques to primary sources that are extant. So the editors have done a really helpful job, and they say, ma'adhiratan ila rabbihim, that yes, Hassan Ansari will surely do an even better job, and I think Madalong is also involved in that edition, which will come out with Brill. But we wanted to start it off, and it's a good thing if what comes after us improves on our edition. We wanted to get the ball rolling, because it wasn't clear when exactly this edition of Ansari would come out.
So if it's okay, I'm going to sort of jump in here, and we've discussed a lot about attribution. We've discussed about the historical context of the work. It would be, I think, a great opportunity to kind of give a schematic overview of what sort of... Kitab al-Maqalat is such a generic name, of course, and you've kind of signaled...
Yes.
So what would be a kind of generic overview of the contents of the work? What's the purpose? Why was it written?
Great. Well, the Maqalat is really a genre, and it is a genre that is established before Abu Ali al-Jubba'i. And of course, the most famous work of Maqalat is the Maqalat al-Islami of al-Ash'ari. There is also the recently edited Maqalat of Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi al-Ka'bi. And this is another early Mu'tazili work that has come out recently. But what this genre aims to do is to explain the different beliefs and dogmas and doctrines entertained and held by different Muslim sects. Now, some of these works are more polemically intentioned than others. This particular maqala, so Ash'ari is often, not always, but often quite dispassionate when he describes the beliefs of different groups.
Right.
And to some extent also Shahrastani in his Milal wa Nahal, but other. So it's you could think of it as part of this genre on heresiography and sectarian writing about different sectarian beliefs. But Abu Ali does not pull his punches, as it were. It's very clear what his views are throughout.
Right.
And as I said, mostly critique of al-Hadith. In terms of structure, it's it's very rich and also very eclectic.
Right.
So there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of structure to it. Right. It seems that he just picks issues that he finds interesting or relevant, and then discusses them. And I would say most of the book, it's not very long. I think the text itself, around, I believe, 130 pages in the printed edition. There's also a Turkish translation, incidentally.
Right.
And about 20 pages or so of the editor's introduction. So he discusses these different beliefs in no particular sequence. Now, the work itself does actually have an introduction by the author, but for whatever reason, not very clear, the introduction begins in media res. So the first part of the introduction seems to be cut off, and he begins by describing the contents of the work.
Right.
And the strange thing is, even though one would assume that from this stage onward the work is complete, although it also seems to end on a rather odd note. The last part of the book describes the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, and the caliphate of Abu Bakr and so on. And then suddenly the copyist, we don't have a colophon, but he says, Tammel, this work, we've completed copying this work and so on, based on the handwriting. It's clear that all of the works in this Majmu'ah collection in the manuscript copied by the same copyist in the year 540 after the Hijrah. But to give you a sample of the kinds of works he discusses, most of it, as I said, is a critique of the Ahl al-Hadith or proto-Sunnis. And for instance, he discusses a range of issues such as the return and descent of the Prophet Isa, alayhi salam, the Dajjal. He discusses al-Silsila, the kind of chain that supposedly some proto-Sunnis said linked or used to link the Sakhra, this rock in Jerusalem, with the heavens.
Right.
He discusses Qadr at length, predestination. He discusses a range of prophets mentioned in the Quran, including Solomon and David and Moses.
Right.
He discusses, it's a very, as you can see,
very eclectic,
very diverse,
right.
And the disparate topics. He just kind of moves from one to the other in no particular sequence. And there are also substantial discussions of the imamate, some very interesting and lively refutations of, for instance, Imami views on leadership of the Muslim community and on the Khawarij, critiques of the proto-Sunnis and their views on the imamate as well. And one does really get the sense, as described in the biographical literature, that al-Jubba'i was, an ingenious debater. And he also engages now and then in takfir of his opponents when he feels their works contradict the explicit teaching of the Quran.
So, in a sense, one of the questions that arises. Sorry, I think I'm going to try and see if I can mute myself and then come back. In a sense, one of the questions that may arise to some of our viewers, a lot of my viewers are likely to be, from a Sunni background. I myself, of course, of that heritage, and Sunnism. Al-Ash'ari comes not too long after Jubba'i, and basically
he's a student, in fact.
He's a student, direct student,
famously a student.
And famous dissenter, so to speak. But in a sense, the question that arises is, what sort of what's of value from a Sunni perspective? And we're talking at a time when you've referred to the proto-Sunnis, so to speak. Sunnism hasn't really sort of established itself.
Not in the form that would be recognized by theologians like al-Jubba'i or something.
Right. And I mean, in a sense, even you have to wait until the Mamluk era and the Subki, synthesis of the Maturidis and the Ash'ari and so on to.
Yeah, so it's a long process that takes many centuries to unfold.
Right, and in a sense, we're looking at a time where the way in which Islam is perceived, and this kind of takes us back to last week's session with on Shamsi's book. In a sense, the nature of the debates transform over time. So what constitutes Islam, what is a meaningful sort of attachment to Islam, varies over time. And, I don't know if you could perhaps reflect on, what it meant to be Muslim. This is a question which is of interest to myself, to someone like Jubba'i, who, later Ash'aris and later Sunnis would, look askance at, but he was, the Mu'tazila were, to all intents and purposes, part of the Muslim community in those societies, even though they might have had a greater predilection for takfir and things like that. But a lot of that was intellectual. It wasn't necessarily sort of, didn't necessarily...
Yes, or it may not have had the real world consequences.
Sorry?
Yes, I mean, you're right, that takfir was really an intellectual exercise that probably didn't have many real world consequences.
Yeah. So I just wonder, how is the world in which Jubba'i wrote, radically different to the world of the sort of mature Ash'ari, and how is that perhaps different to our own times in which the Sunnis have a very distinctive sort of perspective as well?
Yeah. Well, it's the nice thing about early works, and one reason why we should all value early works, as opposed to post-classical ones, you might say, is they afford us, of course, one particular glimpse coming from one perspective of the formation of these schools. When the book was written, Ash'arism as a theological school was not yet a gleam in the eye of al-Ash'ari, so to speak. And even in the lifetime of al-Ash'ari, it's premature to speak of an Ash'arite theological school. And more interestingly, for me, it's quite fascinating to see how the views of the proto-Sunnis clearly diverge from what later becomes, several centuries later, the theological orthodoxy of Ash'arism and later Maturidism.
Right.
So after very briefly refuting the Murji'ah, whom he defines as those who believe faith is just statements and confirmation without actions, the book almost begins with a discussion of the supposed anthropomorphism of the proto-Sunnis. Right. And al-Jubba'i's critique is more or less made in the same terms that the Ash'aris would later make of Hanbalites. Right. So when he describes the views of the proto-Sunnis, he says clearly that these are people who believe that God has a hand, but unlike other hands, which is the same. In fact, exactly how at-Tirmidhi in his Sunan describes the belief of the Sunnis of his period, or the proto-Sunnis, you could say. So it's a curious historical fact, and this is something recognized, at least in academic scholarship, that the views that would have been heretical to the group that anticipated many classical Sunni beliefs, the al-Hadith.
Right.
These heretical views later became the theological mainstream of the Ash'aris, and that's an interesting question. So much of that, the earliest chapters of the work are taken up with figurative interpretation of God's attributes. Now, many of the reports that that al-Jubba'i has difficulty with, the editors trace to well-known and reputable works like Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and the Musnad. But there are, on many issues, things that even somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah, say, in writing many centuries later, would not recognize as authoritatively Sunni. So many beliefs that, say, readers today would find in works of classical tafsir, particularly Tabari and so on, that they would say are problematic in various ways, particularly when it comes to the issue, for example, of the isma or protection from error of prophets. Stories that are largely regarded today as just the invention of storytellers. And then one could give many examples of this, Harut and Marut and the angels or kings. And
the satanic verse seems to be the sort of classical.
Yes, although that one is not mentioned here. So, and if you look at sources from the 3rd century, including the recently re-edited Sharh al-Sunnah, which the Maher al-Jarrar says is really the work of Ghulam Khalil, not al-Barbahari. I mean, he mentions reports that you find in later collections like Tabarani. Tabarani is well known, as Jonathan Brown says, for his fondness for rare or unusual or just weird hadith in his various ma'ajim. And some of them are mentioned here. The idea, for instance, that would be problematic, even to Ibn Taymiyyah, the idea that, and Ibn Taymiyyah specifically criticized this report, that, for instance, God descends to the earth on the day of Arafah. There are all kinds of reports about what happens in variants, and some he even greets pilgrims and so on. But for Jubba'i, these were problematic reports, all an undifferentiated mass, which he attributes to the proto-Sunnis, who certainly were involved in their circulation.
For viewers who are less familiar, and indeed myself, I mean, I don't sort of examine a lot of the early Ahl al-Hadith. Once again, there's a bit of an echo. I'm going to, yes, that's gone now. So with respect to the early Ahl al-Hadith and figures like Ghulam Khalil al-Barbahari, can you give a little background on their significance, how they are linked to Hanbalism in a sense? They are important figures, and in a sense, these are the people who are disparaged subsequently, and even perhaps by their contemporaries like al-Jubba'i, as Hashwiya and as, in a sense, numbskulls who are just transmitting and not really people who are engaging in an intellectual.
So he also uses this the term awam, but somewhat more really to describe them. For him, God has given us the Quran. For him, it has some verses that are clear in their implication, others that are ambiguous and require interpretation. But the only reason that people disagree about it so much is they are impressed with their own abilities, and they uncritically report hadith, and they reject the truth and scorn it because of pride and other reasons. But for him, correct belief is very clear. So, of course, it would be for him.
I mean, this reminds me of a remark I heard Yasir Qadhi mention. He did his PhD on sort of some of these debates between the various Sunni and Mu'tazili, and indeed he's looking at the Ash'ari as well. But he was saying that Ibn Taymiyyah critiques a lot of these people by saying that, well, if it was so clear and so obvious, why do you disagree among yourselves so extreme, so excessively?
Yes. And so I should emphasize that, yes, he's very critical of al-Hadith, but he's by no means somebody who categorically rejects the hadith corpus. He says that most of it is inauthentic and fabricated.
Right.
And those who are interested can look at Rasha al-Amari's excellent article, Accommodation and Resistance, on different Mu'tazili attitudes to hadith. You have some who are very skeptical and rejected effectively everything, others who are less so. So he belongs on that spectrum, not completely categorically critical.
Can you mention the title again, and the author, Russia?
The Accommodation Resistance, that's just the first part of the title by Rasha al-Amari. I'll post it in the comments on YouTube after we record this. So, so he critiques their views on, and most of the book is, there's such and such an issue, they narrate such and such a report, and this is false because, and his big criticism is, not only are such reports impossible and ridiculous, but they contradict the Quran.
Right.
So, for instance, and not only the Quran, but authentic reports. So for him, there are three authentic forms of knowledge, or three means of coming to accurate knowledge about the world.
Right.
These are the five senses, the intellect, and reliable reports. And in this context, he's really thinking about reports that all Muslims accept as authentic and agree upon as authentic.
Sorry, historical reports, or you're saying reliable reports of revelation, of Sama?
I mean, we're talking about not just historical reports. So he gives examples. So, for instance, the existence of Yemen and Mecca and all of these other places, even to somebody who's not visited them. So that's yeah. And again, there's an important PhD thesis on Tawatur by Sheikh Suhail Lahir, and I can also post the name and so on afterwards in YouTube. But most of the book, he reviews these issues. Some of his critiques are really very interesting. I mean, it's a rich book, as I said. So, for instance, he has a fascinating discussion of the question: who is the sacrificial son, Ishmael or Isaac? So we know that there's something that early or proto-Sunni scholars disagreed about a great deal. Tabari himself prefers that it was Isaac, although subsequently, and what we grew up with, of course, is Ismail alayhi salam. He says, based largely on the Quran, that it's clearly Ismail, and he makes it clear that this is the belief of the Arabs, and makes takfir of those who disagree. But his arguments are really ingenious. So based partly on a close reading of the Quran, a very close reading, I should say, of the Quran. So in Surah Safat, when there is a fairly long narrative sequence describing the travails of Abraham, the description of the building of the Kaaba and so on, and then the sacrifice happen, or the sacrifice happens, and then it says that Isaac is born. And because this is a narrative clearly in sequence, the assumption is that the story of the sacrifice happens before Isaac's birth. And another thing, so when Abraham and Sarah are given the good news of Isaac, وَمِن بَعْدِ إِسْحَاقٍ يَعْقُوبٍ وَمِن بَعْدِ إِسْحَاقَ يَعْقُوبٍ. They're already promised when Isaac is born that Jacob will come after him. But if Isaac was to be the sacrificial son, then they wouldn't know that Jacob was to descend from him. Otherwise, there wouldn't really be any point in the test in the first place, right? So as soon as Isaac is born, or even before he's born, in fact, they know that he will have descendants, and one of them will be Jacob. It's a very, very careful reading of the Quran.
Yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Like, if he has been told that Isaac will have descendants. Sorry,
It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, if he's been told that Isaac's going to have descendants, then obviously any effort...
He has to survive in order for that to happen.
So, I mean, that's it's a careful reading, but I wonder why he would basically call those who... I mean, this is another argument, I guess. I mean, I'm using later sort of like ways of doing ta'wil and so on to exclude people from kufr. But, to regard those who reject this and quote, say Isaac is the bih, this seems to be a little sort of extreme, right? And
yes, but from his perspective, and I think he's right as far as factual understanding goes, not right in his takfir. The Quran makes it quite clear that the sacrificial child, the bih, is Ishmael for the reasons we've mentioned. And for him, the reason for, or what leads him to make takfir is that it's anyone who says otherwise is rejecting the teaching of the Quran.
But I mean, it seems that the approach here is that if you reject the Quran, even if it's not willful, whereas the later Sunnis are very, I think, eager to sort of circumscribe when you can, characterize. Well, I mean, it's not universally the case, and we were recently having a conversation about Qadi Iyad, actually. But, circumscribing when someone is called, a kafir.
Yes. Yeah. I should mention there is an interesting anecdote Van Es mentions, taken from a Tawhidi, and it's apocryphal. I very much doubt it's true.
Right. Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
That al-Jubba'i is known to have had a daughter. And anyway, and in fact, one of the works attributed to him is a book where he answers the questions of his daughter, which is, it's called like Masail Ukht Abi Hashim or something like this. So Abu Hashim is son.
And they do takfir of each other. I recall reading this in Van Es.
So Abu Hashim and Abu Ali make takfir of each other, and then the daughter makes takfir of both of them. Now, this is, I imagine, unlikely because we do have biographical material about Abu Ali's burial, and his son was clearly involved in his burial and praying over him and so on. So very doubtful.
Again, maybe this is basically and you can inform me on whether there have been discussions on this as someone who hasn't spent too much time in the early period. Incidentally, thank you, Aisha Said, for your questions. We'll get to them, inshallah. And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to ask. We'll get to them in the last sort of 15 minutes or so, inshallah, or 20 minutes. We're getting there quite soon. But, Shafi'i, for example, and the other Ahl al-Hadith are already quite allergic to saying, Anta kafir. They'll say, Hada kufr, for example.
I mean, if you read, Dirar bin Amr's Kitab al-Tahrish, or even if you read this book,
right?
No, I mean, the Proto-Sunnis make takfir of him and other groups that disagree with them. I mean, there's no sense in fact, when he discusses Khalq al-Quran, the creation of the Quran, which has a few pages devoted to it,
right.
He says that he gives a story that happened in his time of a contemporary being dragged before a qadi by the figures who are clearly Proto-Sunnis, and they're saying he believes the Quran is created, cut off his head, basically. It doesn't end up happening for various reasons.
I mean, are there not serious sort of legal and social implications for in the way that that developed later on, or is it is the state not significant enough at this point for anyone to really enforce any of these kinds of things?
Yeah, and
too decentralized.
Good, and I mean, there's nothing. And Ahmed Shamsi has a wonderful book chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Classical Islamic Theology on the social construction of orthodoxy, when he talks about rare instances where the state did really try to enforce correct belief in a reasonably systematic way, including the Mihna, one of several examples he gives. But this seems to have been, generally speaking, the exception, and really because there's no institutional equivalent to a church. With its powers of disciplining and punishing. You do, of course, find the punishment of people for mistaken beliefs and across the century in different contexts. But generally speaking, it's not kind of systematic and wide-ranging in the way one would say find with the Spanish Inquisition. But that's a separate discussion. I should say, since you're very me and I'm sure many of our viewers are interested in politics and the imamate, there is a lot of discussion across several different chapters of this question. One of his major criticisms of the Ahl al-Hadith is they will accept anyone as ruler, and
Right.
they will justify it with reference to Qadr.
Right.
He has some very interesting arguments against various Shia groups and their beliefs about the imamate. So he refutes in quite creative ways the belief that the imam exists in the world, but his imamate does not manifest in a way that everyone sees, and the claim that he knows the unseen, ilm al-ghayb.
Right.
And he adduces Quranic verses and common sense arguments against it. So he says, for instance, and one of the ways in which we can date the text, he says, well, we know all of these learned people across the world. And he says, in Khurasan, there is so-and-so. In Qayrawan, there is Sahnun, he actually mentions him, dies in 240. Right. And in such a place, there is such and such. And if the imam was present, then, surely we would know about his knowledge and his piety and all of this. And then he gives many stories from the Quran about prophets to refute the claim that the imam knows the future and the unseen and so on. Just so kind of commonsensical arguments.
This is before the 12th imam. I mean, so what's right?
Well, the 12th imam has not gone into his final occultation yet. I mean, it depends on when the work is written, because al-Jubba'i dies in 303 and seems to have lived about 68 years or so.
Right.
So, that is most of the 3rd Islamic century.
Right.
So but
I don't remember the exact date, but I thought the 12th imam kind of disappears, or the occultation takes place in the early 300s, so to speak.
Well, the major occultation is in the 320s.
Okay, right.
For some reason, the date 328 is in my head, but I might be mistaken about that. Mm-hmm. Don't take my word for it.
And so, in a sense, the minor occultation has taken place at this point, and he's basically critiquing that. He's saying that this is absurd.
Yes, so in an example of an argument that will be reprised by people like Ibn Taymiyyah, I mean, I don't think it's the property of Abu Ali, but it's very popular among later Sunnis.
Mm-hmm. Ahmed's actually asking a question. Okay,
excellent question that I'll address first.
Okay.
Yes.
So the question is, why are you referring to proto-Sunnism if already from at least the 2nd century people call themselves Sunni and are referred to as such?
Very good. So this is in deference to the, scholarly convention, although even in the text itself, several times he talks about people who are Sunni versus people who are Bid'i. He talks about people who are Sunni Jama'i. He talks about Sunnah wa Jama'ah. So this terminology is clearly around some time before.
But my impression is that it's used in a more narrow sense at this point in time, and it becomes a bit more of a broader umbrella.
The reason I refer to proto-Sunnis, and there's a great article on the identity of the Sahib Sunnah by Gossett, not the article by John Nawas, but another author whose name currently escapes me, and he surveys this term and so on. And its uses, and Jonathan Brown and Scott Lucas have also used the term proto-Sunni to refer to figures of the 3rd Islamic century, like Bukhari and Ahmed, even though the term Sunnism is clearly present in this context, because the Sunnism of the Ahl al-Hadith is clearly distinct from classical Sunnism. Let's say it's the Ash'aris and Maturidis and what have you. So I make this distinction purely in deference to the existing scholarly terminology. But you're right. I mean, in fact, Ahmed said a long time ago that Dirar bin Amr uses this terminology already in Kitab al-Tahrish, which is 2nd century, mid or late 2nd century probably. He talks about Sahib Sunnah wa Jama'ah and this kind of terminology. So the terminology is there, but I'm just deferring to the
pardon my ignorance. Dirar ibn Amr falls under which of these sort of sectarian groupings? Is he not a Mu'tazili himself? Or?
Well, he's normally identified as a Mu'tazili.
Right.
Many Mu'tazila reject that label because he's known to have subscribe to a belief in Qadr and predestination, although in this book and other sources, in fact, there is an account that he makes tawbah from this belief at the hands of Ali al-Suwari. So some sources say he later gave up this belief, but many Mu'tazila reject this description. But I think for outsiders, he's considered basically a Mu'tazili because he does have other things in common with them.
We're very grateful, to have someone like Ahmed Shamsi watching. Jazakallah khairan. And of course, Aisha Said,
yes, I should turn to those.
We apologize for sort of jumping the queue with Ahmed. If it's he was commenting on something very specific to what Omar was saying. Omar,
yes.
I mean, if you want, you can wrap up what you were saying now, and we could start.
Yes, no, I think that's we can entertain questions from now on since we've started with Ahmed. Yeah. I hope that answers the question. But anyway,
it's a wide-ranging text. I mean, I think from what you've said,
yes, it's a wide-ranging text.
Yeah, we can gather that there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here, particularly for intellectual historians of early Islam, particularly those interested in authenticity debates.
Yes, I should stress, by the way, not only is it a very rich, superlatively rich source for people working on early theology, early tafsir, hadith studies, and so on. Occasionally, the author throws out material of really interest to anyone. To give an example, those working on gender. So when criticizing Imami beliefs about Fadak and the supposed confrontation that happens between Abu Bakr and Fatima after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he says, well, this idea that Fatima confronted Abu Bakr or Omar or any of these others is absurd because, what was Ali doing just sitting at home while his wife went out and confronted them? Surely he would have stopped his wife from doing this, and if the need had existed, would have done it himself. And very interestingly, he says, in our time, if a commoner from the market allowed his wife to go to the Masjid Jami', the congregational mosque of the town, there would be uproar, and he would be
fascinating
excoriated for allowing this to happen. This kind of
and Jubba'i is based Jubba'i is based in the metropole, right? I mean, he's based.
Yeah, well, he's Basran, but he visits Baghdad and many times, and other regions as well. But he's based in Basra. And this is why in this period he's kind of designated the Basran, one of the major figures in the Basran Mu'tazila.
But that's a fascinating insight. I mean, in a sense, I mean, we're all sort of embedded within historical moments, and we have a tendency to think our historical practice is the norm. And so I assume this is partly his tendency to be someone who doesn't necessarily value hadith a great deal in terms of its probative value. I don't know. I mean, so quite easily something which
he cites hadith as evidence and opinions of companions as evidence to support his views. And it's not always clear. Yes, so this reports that Shafi'i mentions in his dialogues with the al-Kalam or debate, for instance, that you have to compare it to the Quran, and if it contradicts, then get rid of it, and if it agrees, then you can use it, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to come back on one of those points in a moment. If it's all right, I'm just going to pick on one of Aisha Said's questions. She sent in two. So the second one was on takfir, which was something we were more recently discussing. Why was takfir not practiced during the time of the Prophet? How did it enter into our traditions? And I mean, that's an interesting question. Omar, if you don't mind, I'll sort of like take a stab at it. I mean, one assumes based on what it says in the Quran that there were types of takfir, that occurred in the time of the Prophet. Like, don't no, ولا تقل لمن ألقى إليكم السلام لست مؤمنة أو مسلمة مؤمنة. I think it was like
but this is different. This is people concealing their Muslim identity for fear of danger. But I mean, for me, there is no takfir in the time of the Prophet for very clear reasons. I mean, because unless you're talking about the hypocrites, right? You could say that is a kind of takfir.
Right.
because the Prophet is there. So there's no divergence in the Muslim community because they have one leader whom they all agree to accept as a leader. These kinds of divergences and disagreements only emerge once the Prophet ﷺ passes to meet his Lord. And in that context, divergence, even from when he's the disagreement about his burial and so on, which is discussed in this book, difference appears very early. So I traditionally...
And you have the Hurub al-Ridda, which have, I think retrospectively very often read as a case of takfir. But
yes,
I think it's more complicated than that personally, right? I mean, it's...
Yes, there are different groups. So some of them clearly reject belief in the Prophet or say that our obligation only existed to pay the zakah during his lifetime, and others who accept other prophets. And so you have a variety of groups.
Right.
But in later Sunni understanding, say Ibn Taymiyyah, refusing to pay zakah and implying that it is not obligatory is itself,
of course,
unbelief.
A rejection of something which is ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura, or
necessarily
known. Okay, Jazakumullah khairan on that. I'm going to, so there's a follow-up from Aisha Saeed. And if anyone else has questions, please feel free to ask. She's saying, yes, I am referring to the fact that even with clear knowledge of existence of hypocrites who are in the Quran itself described as being in the hellfire, they are not...
and all of these other verses, which clearly suggest they're not real Muslims.
Yes.
So you could I suppose accept that as a kind of takfir.
But again, it's not really coming from the Prophet; it's coming from the Quran itself. So, it's an interesting. I mean, it's divine intervention saying that these people are not truly. And the Prophet's response to that is to say, "Well, I'm not going to let people say Muhammad's killing his own companions." And so, that's a very interesting sort of situation as well. It's very pragmatic in many respects. Of course, it makes a lot of sense, socially, so to speak.
Yes. We should probably say something about them, mate. So in answer to that early question...
Sorry. Yeah, this is the early question. Have there been any specific efforts to contextualize hadith within the framework of the Quran? That's a very broad question in my mind.
Yes.
I mean, let me relate something to that question, which is, when you were talking about the way in which Jubba'i, in a sense, is very readily rejects a hadith on the basis of هذا يعارض القرآن or something along those lines. It goes against the Quran. It just made me think of the Hanafis, right? I mean, the early Hanafis would be quite, you could say, trigger happy with, so to speak, with respect to saying, well, this goes against the of the Quran, and so we do not apply it, right? And of course, the Mu'tazila found a home among the Hanafis for a long period of time. And I don't know how quickly the Maturidis were accepted as genuinely members of Ahl Sunnah. Perhaps some early sort of debates would have labeled them as basically too close to the Mu'tazila, even though the Mu'tazila were their major targets, right? So of attack. So yeah, I wonder how you think about the Hanafis with respect to the Mu'tazila, if you can comment on that, and perhaps
and people like Salman Yunus are in a much better position than I am to answer questions like this.
Right.
I would say the Hanafis are not well. There is a deference to the hadith in some respects that becomes more pronounced over time. So already an author like Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, clearly more deferential to the hadith corpus and even willing to change his views on some issues than, say, Abu Hanifa.
Right.
And then with a figure like Tahawi, you have somebody who's trained in the methods of al-hadith,
right,
but uses those methods to defend Hanafi opinion. So, and this is my own view, and it's a fairly polemical one. And most of the time it seems Hanafis are not rejecting hadith for any reason consistently other than the fact that those hadith contradict their particular teachings.
Right.
And it's very clear if you look at Tahawi, whenever so for instance, when he engages with a hadith on Raf' al-Yadayn or many other issues, his interpretations and his rejections of some, and there's not much consistency except this contradiction of the Hanafi school.
And,
so
yeah, in a sense, it's like, you have madhab Ahl al-Madina and you have madhab Ahl al-Kufa. In a sense, it's saying that the practice that was established, and that later Hanafis actually, perhaps even early Hanafis, elaborate arguments about the significance of Kufa, because Ali radiallahu anhu was there, Ibn Mas'ud was there, etc. The knowledge of that city was obviously so there's an effort to valorize. And one of the things that I've not really systematized, and I need to read more of Ahmed Shamsi's actually work and other scholars in order to do justice to this entire discussion, is how much of early law is quite obviously cognitive dissonance. We have a practice here. We want to
even said many decades ago that, I don't agree with everything he said, but
of course, yeah.
once the Sunnah of the Prophet becomes authoritative, which is a point I don't agree with him on, then the actual body of doctrines of these schools didn't suddenly change overnight. What happened is they found ways of defending them, and sometimes that involved in shakhs reading the fabrication of hadith. Although I don't find that entirely persuasive, because they did find ways of reinterpreting them and diffusing them. And Benam Sadiqi's account of the interaction of Hanafism in particular with hadith in his book is a great kind of.
And the remarkable flexibility of interpretation over time as well.
Yes, so he talks about maximal hermeneutic flexibility, that effectively, a hadith could mean almost anything, as long as it didn't, as long as that interpretation didn't contradict the madhab.
But of course, Shakh's approach to this is, of an older generation of scholars to basically say, well, these people are fabricating stuff, etc. And I think it's far more, I'm speaking to a certain extent as an insider to a tradition, and also someone trained in the later Hanafi madhab, the 20th century version of it. But also, historically, I think this is quite, defensible in the sense that, so from a theological perspective, you can say that, there are competing conceptions of what the Sunnah was. And that includes the way in which that tradition is, understood by these generations.
Because its transmission is localized for most of the first 2 centuries, highly localized.
And as long as some kind of, ultimately the commitment to the Quran and Sunnah is there, but, various other, human propensities to prefer local traditions, etc., are always going to, this is in a sense, Shafi'i's major intervention. Tahawi can no longer argue that, well, that's how we do it here. He's saying, no, that's how we do it, and here are the hadiths to prove it, right? But as long as it's anchored in that commitment to the Quran and the Sunnah, I think, that's basically what the Sunnis said.
Yes,
that's what's defensible.
Yeah, but again, even al-Jubba'i would not disagree, but for him the Sunnah is a particular body of hadith. Even for someone like Dirar ibn Amr, who's more categorically skeptical of hadith, even though he cites a few of them in Kitab al-Tahrish as evidence. The only thing that you can truly regard to belong to the Sunnah are those hadith that Muslims accept, generally speaking. Even different groups accept as authentic, essentially. And that's a much smaller corpus than the Ahli Hadith, who have a much more expansive view of what the Sunnah of the Prophet is.
Yeah. But what's really interesting is even as late as the 20th century, you have someone like, I forget the name, but Ashraf Tanvi's sort of nephew or something like that, who writes I'ala as-Sunan, in partnership.
It's a collaborative enterprise, that book.
Yeah, as I understand it, it is kind of under the direction of Ashraf Tanvi, but the other Osmani, I forget his full name, is the main sort of brains behind it. And, it's, those of us who aren't very staunch Hanafis will kind of look at it and think, well, you're really trying to stretch the limits of,
Yes. And it's very much like Tahawi's project vis-a-vis Hanafism to defend it through hadith. But why does this challenge, and why does the al-Sunan emerge? It's in response to the Ahli Hadith, basically.
Right.
Not to be confused with the original hadith.
But again, I think.
But because we're coming to the end, we should return to Jubba'i.
Yes, sorry.
The subcontinent of the 20th century.
Right. Khairan, I mean, please do sort of like perhaps give your final thoughts on Jubba'i. I actually apologize for.
So it's a fascinating text. I think the editors have done a great job of tracing this material.
Right.
I mean, they always trace it to primary sources, so they don't, with the exception of the introduction, they don't make reference to any secondary sources when footnoting the hadith and so on. Right. So there's, as far as I know, there's no reference at all to Van Esse's Theologian Society, Theologian Gesellschaft, and many of the reports and issues discussed here do feature in that book, so that would have been useful. They do refer to secondary scholarship in Turkish and as well.
We can look for some of that in Madlung and Ansari's edition, inshallah.
Yeah, but I mean, they've done the most of the spade work, and I wouldn't want to criticize them too much. You can always do more. You can always find more books in which these reports are found. And so on.
Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. I mean, if you like, you can briefly comment on what we're going to be doing next week, inshallah.
Sure. And so I have brought, I remember to bring the copy. So next week, we will be talking again about a discussion of early stuff and origins. And this is Sean Anthony's book, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the Empires of Faith, which is a book about the Sirah or Sirah Maghazi literature and new kind of techniques we can use to recover early material and so on. So it's a very exciting, and we'll discuss it next week, inshallah.
As I understand, Sean Anthony's kind of, in a sense, proposing fairly groundbreaking methods.
Yes, I mean it's very creative. I mean it's of course part of a larger scholarly endeavor that seeks to build upon and transcend revisionism and its kind of extreme skepticism. Right. And it's more optimistic or sanguine about the possibility of recovering early material on the Sirah Maghazi and early Islamic history and so on. So that's what we'll be discussing next week. I should say, yes, this is a show featuring two guys. So far, discussing books by other males, dead and or living. Sorry, but we will once we've looked at Sean Anthony's book, hopefully be discussing more books by female authors, of course, of whom there's no small number and many excellent books. So I look forward to getting to that. This is a problem we've been aware of, but partly for reasons of my own circumstances, I've been restricted to a few books. Things will open up in coming weeks. Inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. I mean, I think, and that point is, I think, well taken. Also, inshallah, I hope that I'm very grateful for Aisha Saeed's engagement, because it does make it broader than just a men's club, sort of, to have conversations on these things. And I think there's a great deal of value and perspective that can be garnered from sort of the female persuasion, shall we say.
Yes, not stated in a condescending way, of course. And I myself have benefited. I think most of the teaching I do and most of the discussion revolves around works by scholars who just happen to be female. So we will get onto that very soon, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan. And we look forward to seeing you in a week's time. And until then, fi amanillah.
Stay safe, stay healthy.
Stay safe.
Do not go out unless absolutely necessary. And we'll see you next time, inshallah.
Inshallah. Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.